The funeral flowers had long since wilted when Marcus Rivera finally opened the manila envelope his wife had left him. 3 months had passed since Sarah's battle with cancer ended. 3 months of sleepless nights, and burnt dinners, and trying to explain to 7-year-old Daniel why Mommy wasn't coming home. The envelope sat on their kitchen table like an accusation, thick with legal documents he couldn't bear to face while his world was still spinning sideways. Before we explore this incredible journey, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. Outside their small apartment in Phoenix, the late October heat pressed against the windows like an unwelcome visitor that refused to leave. Daniel sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, building elaborate structures with his Lego blocks, the same focused concentration his mother used to have when she sketched architectural blueprints at this same table. Marcus watched his son through the doorway, noting how the boy's shoulders had started to curve inward, how his laughter came less often now, how he still set 2 plates for breakfast before remembering they were a family of 2. The apartment felt smaller every day, filled with memories that had nowhere else to go. Sarah's coffee mug still sat in the dish drainer, unwashed since that final morning when she'd been too weak to finish drinking from it. Her reading glasses remained folded on the nightstand beside a book she'd never get to finish. Marcus couldn't bring himself to move these things, but he couldn't bear looking at them either. It was like living inside a museum of his own grief, surrounded by artifacts of a life that had ended too soon. The envelope contained what Marcus expected at first: insurance papers that would barely cover the medical bills, the deed to their small apartment, Sarah's final wishes, written in her careful handwriting that had grown shakier with each passing week. But tucked beneath the familiar documents was something else, something that made Marcus sit up straighter in his chair and forget, for a moment, the ache that had lived in his chest since the funeral. A second deed, yellowed with age and smelling faintly of lavender and old paper, bearing an address he'd never heard of: 100742 Industrial Boulevard, Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The property description was sparse, clinical in its brevity. Commercial office building, 15 floors, built in 1978. But the signature at the bottom was what made Marcus's hands tremble as he held the document. Sarah's grandmother's name, written in the spidery handwriting of a woman Marcus had met only once at their wedding, severe and silent in the back pew, like a guardian of secrets no one else was allowed to share. According to the attached letter, written in that same careful script, the building had been left to Sarah upon the old woman's death 2 years ago. Sarah had never mentioned it, never spoken of inheriting property or dealing with legal matters involving her grandmother's estate. It was as if this piece of her family's history had been deliberately hidden, tucked away like something shameful or dangerous. Marcus turned the deed over in his calloused hands, studying every detail as if the paper itself might reveal why his wife had kept this secret. He'd worked construction for 15 years, had learned to read blueprints and building codes, to understand the bones of structures and the stories they told. But this felt different, heavier somehow, like holding a piece of someone else's puzzle with no idea where it fit, or what picture it was meant to complete. The next morning, Marcus made coffee with shaking hands and searched the address online while Daniel ate cereal and watched cartoons, with the volume turned low. The satellite images that loaded on his laptop screen showed a gray, concrete tower rising from a landscape that looked like it had been abandoned by time itself. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, appeared to be the kind of town where factories had closed and never reopened, where young people left and never came back, where the American dream had packed its bags sometime in the 1980s and moved somewhere with better prospects. The building itself stood alone in the center of an industrial wasteland, surrounded by cracked parking lots and chain-link fences that protected nothing but weeds and broken dreams. Its windows were dark as dead eyes, and even through the grainy satellite imagery, Marcus could see the stains of weather and neglect that marked its concrete facade like scars from decades of harsh winters and indifferent summers. Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair sticking up in directions that defied both physics and the careful combing Marcus had attempted that morning. He clutched a battered stuffed elephant that Sarah had sewn for his 4th birthday, back when she still had the energy for projects that involved late nights and tiny stitches, and the kind of love that showed itself through handmade gifts. "Daddy, are we having cereal again?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying the patient resignation of a child who had learned not to expect variety in a household where grief had replaced routine. Marcus closed the laptop and pulled his son onto his lap, breathing in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. Daniel felt solid and warm against his chest, a reminder that some things in his life were still worth protecting, still worth fighting for. "How would you feel about taking a trip, buddy?" Marcus asked, the words coming out before he'd fully formed the plan behind them. "Maybe seeing someplace new?" Daniel's eyes, the same deep brown as his mother's, widened with the first real interest Marcus had seen from him in weeks. "Like Disneyland?" he asked, hope creeping into his voice like sunrise after a long night. "Not exactly," Marcus said carefully, not wanting to disappoint, but unable to promise magic kingdoms when their bank account barely covered rent. "But maybe somewhere we could build something together. Would you like that?" Daniel nodded with the enthusiasm of a child who had inherited his father's love of construction and his mother's belief that broken things could always be fixed if you cared enough to try. "Can we bring my Legos?" "Of course we can bring your Legos." 3 days later, they were driving east in Marcus's pickup truck, everything they owned packed in boxes in the bed and covered with a tarp that flapped in the October wind like a flag of surrender. Daniel sat beside him in his booster seat, coloring books spread across his lap, humming songs that Sarah used to sing when she thought no one was listening. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of them, carrying them toward a future that Marcus couldn't imagine and wasn't sure he wanted to face. They stopped for gas in Oklahoma City, where the afternoon sun beat down on asphalt that shimmered with heat waves and broken promises. Daniel fell asleep with his head against the window as they drove through the night, small fingers still clutching his stuffed elephant, and Marcus found himself thinking about the last conversation he'd had with Sarah before the morphine took her words away and left only the sound of machines keeping time with her failing heart. "There are things," she'd whispered, her hand barely strong enough to squeeze his, her voice so faint he'd had to lean close to hear her. "Things I should have told you. About my family. About who we really were before everything changed." He'd thought she was talking about her cancer, about the way the disease had rewritten their lives and stolen months that should have been filled with Daniel's soccer games and family dinners and lazy Sunday mornings that stretched into afternoon naps. Now, staring at the endless ribbon of highway illuminated by his headlights, Marcus wondered if she'd meant something else entirely, something connected to a building in Pennsylvania that she'd never mentioned, and a grandmother whose secrets had outlived her silence. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, announced itself with a rusted welcome sign that looked like it had been installed during the Carter administration and forgotten ever since. The town center consisted of 3 blocks of empty storefronts with soap-covered windows and faded "For rent" signs that had become permanent fixtures. A diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the invention of the microwave sat between a closed bank and a pharmacy that advertised prescriptions and hunting licenses with equal enthusiasm. Marcus pulled into the parking lot of a motel that charged $39 a night, and came with the kind of carpet that had witnessed more stories than anyone wanted to hear. The desk clerk was a thin man with tired eyes who took Marcus's cash without asking questions and handed over keys attached to a plastic fob shaped like a miniature Liberty Bell. The room smelled like disinfectant and other people's disappointments, but it was clean enough and warm enough, and Daniel seemed to find adventure in sleeping somewhere new. Marcus tucked his son into one of the twin beds and sat on the other, staring out the window at the sodium lights that cast everything in the sickly yellow glow of institutional neglect. Tomorrow they would see the building that had somehow become their inheritance, their only shot at something that might resemble a future. Marcus had lost his construction job 2 weeks after Sarah's funeral, when the medical bills had forced him to miss too many days, and his supervisor had finally run out of patience with grief that interfered with productivity. Their savings had evaporated during Sarah's final months, feeding the endless appetite of hospitals and specialists, and experimental treatments that bought time but not hope. The small life insurance payout would keep them afloat for maybe 6 months if Marcus was careful, if he found work soon. If nothing else went wrong, the building had to be worth something, even if it was just the value of the land beneath it. He could sell it, use the money to start over somewhere else, maybe find work in a city where construction was still happening, and single fathers with gaps in their employment history could still find employers willing to take a chance. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one he had. And sometimes hope came in packages smaller than you expected. Morning came gray and cold, with the kind of October chill that promised an early winter, and reminded Marcus that Phoenix's perpetual summer was now 1,000 miles behind them. He and Daniel ate breakfast at the diner, where the waitress had kind eyes and called Daniel sweetheart, while she poured Marcus coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous decade. The locals stared at them with the polite curiosity of people unused to strangers, and Marcus caught fragments of whispered conversations that seemed to center around the building on Industrial, and questions about what the man and his boy were planning to do with it. Their interest felt more than casual, charged with the kind of tension that suggested the building meant something to these people, something they weren't sure they wanted to share with outsiders. 1742 Industrial Boulevard sat at the end of a potholed road that seemed to lead nowhere else, like a street that had been forgotten by the city planners and abandoned to weeds and wishful thinking. The building rose 15 floors into the gray sky, its concrete facade stained with decades of weather and neglect, windows dark and lifeless, many of them cracked or boarded over with plywood that had warped and faded to the color of old bones. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but the gate hung open on rusted hinges, its padlock long since broken or simply abandoned. Marcus parked the truck in the empty lot and helped Daniel out, feeling the boy's small hand find his as they approached the structure that now belonged to them, whether they wanted it or not. "It looks scary, Daddy," Daniel said softly, his voice barely audible above the wind that whistled through the fence links and rattled loose pieces of metal siding. Marcus squeezed his son's hand, drawing strength from the simple trust in those brown eyes that looked so much like Sarah's. "Sometimes scary things are just things that need fixing," he said, remembering something his own father had told him years ago when he'd been afraid to climb a ladder. Like when you're scared of the dark, but all it really needs is a light switch. The building's directory, mounted beside the sealed main entrance, was cracked and faded beyond easy reading. Most of the company names were illegible, lost to decades of sun and rain, and the kind of casual vandalism that happened when places were left empty long enough for people to forget they had ever mattered. But Marcus could make out fragments of what had once been there. Millbrook Development Corp., First National, Industrial Planning, all dated from the late 70s and early 80s, from a time when this place had been alive with purpose and possibility. Marcus found a side entrance that opened with the keys Sarah's grandmother had left with the deed. The lock turned easily, too easily for a building that was supposed to have been abandoned for decades. The door swung inward with a groan that echoed in the empty space beyond, releasing air that smelled like old paper and dust and something else, something metallic and cold, that Marcus couldn't identify but didn't like. The lobby was surprisingly intact, its marble floors hidden beneath decades of dirt but uncracked, still showing the quality of workmanship that had gone into the building's original construction. An elevator bank stood against one wall, its brass buttons green with tarnish but still gleaming faintly in the weak light that filtered through grimy windows. Directory boards that had once listed dozens of companies now held only empty slots and the occasional fragment of a nameplate that hadn't been worth stealing. "Hello?" Marcus called out, his voice echoing in the empty space like a question that had been waiting years for someone to ask it. No answer came back, but somewhere in the building, something creaked, a sound that might have been settling concrete, or might have been something else entirely, something that suggested they weren't as alone as the silence implied. Daniel pressed closer to his father's leg, small fingers gripping the fabric of Marcus's jeans. "Is anyone here?" he whispered. "I don't think so, buddy," Marcus said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "I think it's just been waiting for us." They explored the ground floor together, Marcus's construction-trained eye cataloging what he saw, with the automatic assessment that came from years of evaluating buildings for structural integrity and renovation potential. The building's bones were solid, steel, and concrete that had been built to last during an era when corners weren't cut and inspectors couldn't be bought with campaign contributions and handshake deals. The electrical system would need complete rewiring, and the plumbing was probably shot, corroded by decades of disuse and Pennsylvania winters that had frozen and thawed the pipes until they gave up trying to hold water. But the structure itself was sound, built with the kind of over-engineering that had been standard in the 70s, when energy was cheap and building codes were written by people who expected their work to outlast their careers. With enough work and money he didn't have, this could be something beautiful again, something worth saving. Marcus could see it in his mind. Offices filled with natural light, conference rooms where people made decisions that mattered, lobbies where visitors felt welcome instead of forgotten. It would take months of labor and resources he couldn't afford, but the potential was there, waiting beneath layers of neglect like a masterpiece hidden under old paint. The stairwell was the building's spine, a concrete column that rose through its center with the austere functionality of institutional architecture. Emergency lighting cast weak pools of illumination on each landing, suggesting that someone was still paying the electric bill, even though no one was supposed to be here. The lights hummed with the tired persistence of fluorescent fixtures that had been burning for decades, marking time in a building that time seemed to have forgotten. They climbed to the third floor, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space with a rhythm that sounded almost like music, like a heartbeat, counting out the seconds until something important was going to happen. The office floors were mazes of cubicle walls and abandoned furniture, everything covered in dust, so thick It looked like snow that had fallen years ago and never melted. Computer monitors from the 80s sat dark and silent on metal desks that bore the scars of coffee rings and cigarette burns. From an era when smoking indoors was still legal and personal computers were still novelties that required their own furniture. Coffee cups held decades of mold that had grown and died and grown again, creating ecosystems of decay that flourished in the perpetual twilight of empty offices. It was like walking through a museum of the recent past, preserved in abandonment, frozen at the moment when the last worker had turned off the lights and locked the door and never come back. Marcus could almost hear the ghosts of conversations that had once filled these spaces. Deals being made, reports being dictated, phones ringing with the urgent business of a world that had moved on without looking back. On the 7th floor, Daniel tugged on his father's sleeve with the insistence of a child who had noticed something that adults might miss. "Daddy, look." One of the offices still had power. Light spilled from beneath a closed door like golden water, and Marcus could hear the soft hum of electronics, the whispered conversation of machines talking to each other in languages made of electricity and purpose. It was the first sign of active life they'd encountered in the building. Proof that someone had been here recently, that the abandonment wasn't as complete as it appeared. Marcus approached the door carefully, Daniel behind him, one hand on his son's shoulder and the other reaching for the handle. He knocked on the door frame with the courtesy of someone who understood that even empty buildings could have occupants who valued privacy. "Hello? Is someone there?" The humming stopped. Then, after a moment that stretched too long and felt too deliberate, the lights went out, plunging the office into the same darkness that filled the rest of the building. Marcus tried the door handle, but it was locked, and the heavy wooden door didn't budge when he put his shoulder against it, with the experimental pressure of someone testing boundaries without wanting to cross lines. "Who do you think was in there?" Daniel whispered, his voice carrying the mixture of fear and excitement that children brought to mysteries they didn't fully understand. Marcus didn't have an answer. The building was supposed to be empty, had been empty for decades, according to the property records he'd reviewed online. But someone had been paying for electricity. Someone had been here recently enough to cut power when unexpected visitors knocked on their door. Someone who didn't want to be found but couldn't resist the comfort of working with the lights on. They spent the afternoon exploring the upper floors, each level revealing more mysteries that defied the simple explanation of an abandoned office building. The top 3 floors had been executive suites once, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the abandoned industrial landscape, stretching toward the horizon, like a post-apocalyptic monument to economic decline. In what had been the CEO's office, Marcus found a safe built into the wall behind a landscape painting that depicted mountains and forests that looked nothing like the flat industrial terrain visible through the windows. The safe's combination dial was worn smooth by countless hands, suggesting decades of regular use. But it was locked now, keeping its secrets behind steel and silence. Daniel pressed his face against one of the windows, breath fogging the glass as he stared out at the empty lots and rusted machinery that surrounded their building. In the distance, the town of Millbrook spread across the landscape like a collection of children's toys that someone had scattered and forgotten to pick up. "Daddy, can we live here?" Daniel asked, his voice muffled by the glass but clear in its hopeful curiosity. Marcus joined his son at the window, looking out over the desolation that would be their view if they decided to make this place their home. It wasn't much to look at, but it was something. And this building, broken as it was, belonged to them in a way that their Phoenix apartment never had. Rented month to month with a security deposit that never felt secure, and walls too thin to contain the sound of other people's lives, pressing in from all sides. "Would you want to live here?" Marcus asked. Daniel nodded with the seriousness of a child who had learned that home was wherever his family happened to be. "It's big enough for both of us. And Mommy could visit us here, right? She could see us from heaven." Marcus felt his throat tighten with the familiar ache of loss mixed with love. The grief that never really went away but sometimes transformed itself into something that felt almost like hope. "Yeah, buddy. She could see us from anywhere." That night, back at the motel where the carpet smelled like industrial cleaning products and broken dreams, Marcus sat in the moldy armchair by the window and called the utility companies. The information he received was as puzzling as everything else about the building. The electric bill was paid automatically from an account that had been established in 1978, with enough money deposited to cover basic service for decades. The water and gas had been shut off years ago, victims of Pennsylvania winters and pipes that couldn't survive the freeze-thaw cycles without regular maintenance. But electricity had flowed continuously for more than 4 decades, keeping emergency lighting functional and powering whatever electronic equipment someone had installed in that 7th-floor office. No one at the electric company could tell him who had set up the account or why it had never been cancelled. The original paperwork had been digitized and redigitized so many times that details had been lost in translation, leaving only the basic fact that someone, somewhere, continued to pay for power in a building that was supposed to be empty. Marcus also called the county assessor's office and learned that property taxes on the building had been paid in full every year, always on time, always from the same mysterious account that covered the electricity. The building was legally abandoned, but financially maintained. A contradiction that made no sense, according to any reasonable interpretation of how commercial real estate was supposed to work. Daniel fell asleep clutching his stuffed elephant, and Marcus sat in the chair by the window, staring out at the dark silhouette of their inherited building against the night sky. One window on the 7th floor glowed with soft light. The same office they'd found locked that afternoon. Someone was definitely in there. Someone who had keys and access and reasons for working after dark in a building that had supposedly been empty since the Reagan administration. Marcus made a decision that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. Tomorrow, he would find out who shared their inheritance and what they were trying to hide. He would also start making plans to renovate the building, to turn it into something that could house a new life for him and Daniel, something that honored Sarah's memory by creating a future instead of just surviving the present. He thought about Sarah's words that last night, about things she should have told him, secrets that had died with her, but lived on in manila envelopes and brass keys, and buildings that weren't as empty as they appeared. Maybe this building was one of those things she couldn't explain, part of a family history that included more than she'd ever been able to share. Outside, the light in the 7th floor window went out, plunging the building back into the darkness that had claimed most of Millbrook's industrial dreams. But Marcus wasn't discouraged. Tomorrow, he would start bringing the place back to life, one room at a time, one mystery at a time. Tomorrow, he would begin to understand what his wife had left them, and why someone was still keeping the lights on in a building that the world had forgotten. The inheritance Sarah's grandmother had left them was more than concrete and steel. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved, a story waiting to be told. And maybe, if Marcus was brave enough to dig for the truth, a chance to build something that mattered from the ruins of something that had been deliberately forgotten. Tomorrow, the real exploration would begin. The next morning brought the kind of cold that made Daniel's breath visible as they walked across the parking lot toward the building, their footsteps crunching on frost that glittered like broken diamonds in the weak October sunlight. Marcus had packed a toolbox and a thermos of coffee, basic supplies for what he expected to be a long day of cataloging what needed to be fixed and planning how to transform 15 floors of neglect into something resembling a home. The building looked different in the gray morning light, less intimidating and more like what it really was, a problem that could be solved with enough work, determination, and money he didn't have but would somehow have to find. Marcus had spent half the night sketching renovation plans on motel stationery, rough drawings that showed how the executive floors could be converted into living space, while the lower levels housed workshops and offices that might generate enough income to make the project sustainable. They entered through the side door again. But this time, Marcus noticed something he'd missed during yesterday's exploration. Fresh footprints in the dust of the lobby. Boot prints that were too large to be his own, and too recent to be from previous days' investigation. Someone else had been here since they'd left. Someone who knew the building well enough to move through it, without making noise or turning on lights that might attract attention. The elevator buttons lit up when Marcus pressed them, and after a moment of groaning and mechanical complaint that sounded like an old man getting out of bed, the doors slid open with surprising smoothness. The car was lined with polished brass that had tarnished but not corroded, and it rose steadily to the 7th floor when Marcus pressed the button, carrying them toward the mysterious office that had gone dark yesterday when they'd knocked on its door. The corridor outside the locked office was empty, but the door that had been secured yesterday now stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of the room beyond. Marcus approached it carefully, Daniel close behind him, and pushed it open with the tip of his work boot, ready to retreat if whoever was inside didn't welcome visitors. The office had been cleaned recently, thoroughly and professionally. The furniture was covered with white sheets that looked like they'd been laundered and pressed, and the air smelled of industrial disinfectant mixed with the ozone scent of electronic equipment that had been running for a long time. A bank of computer monitors sat dark and silent on a desk that looked like it belonged in a space program control room rather than an abandoned office building. Cables ran beneath the floor and up through the ceiling, suggesting a communication system that connected to something beyond this room, possibly beyond this building. The setup was too elaborate and too expensive to be the work of squatters or urban explorers. Someone with resources and purpose had been maintaining this facility, using it for activities that required both secrecy and sophisticated technology. On the desk, positioned where Marcus couldn't miss it, Prazind, someone had left a manila folder with his name, written on the front in block letters, that looked like they'd been formed by someone accustomed to writing reports and filing official documents. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message that was polite but carried an undertone of authority that made Marcus's construction worker instincts warn him he was dealing with people who weren't accustomed to being questioned. "Mr. Rivera, we need to talk. Tonight, 8 p.m. Room 1512. Come alone. D.K." Daniel peered over his father's shoulder at the note, reading the words with the careful attention he brought to homework assignments and street signs. "Who's D.K.? Daddy?" "I don't know, buddy," Marcus said, though something about the initials stirred a memory he couldn't quite place, like a name heard in conversation but not quite caught. "But I think we're about to find out." They spent the rest of the morning exploring the building more thoroughly. Marcus taking measurements and making notes about what would need to be replaced, repaired, or simply cleaned before the space could be habitable. The structure was solid, better than solid. Whoever had designed this place in 1978 had spared no expense on materials and craftsmanship, building it like a fortress that could withstand anything the Pennsylvania weather or economic climate might throw at it. But there were oddities that troubled Marcus's systematic mind. Architectural features that didn't fit the building's supposed function as a conventional office complex. Walls that seemed thicker than they needed to be, with spaces between them that suggested hidden passages or utility corridors that didn't appear on any floor plan he could imagine. Rooms with no apparent purpose, their doorways sealed with newer construction that looked like afterthoughts, designed to hide something rather than improve functionality. The freight elevator that Marcus had noticed during his first exploration definitely descended farther than the building's foundation should have allowed, its lowest button labeled SB3 in the kind of official lettering used on government installations. When Marcus pressed it, the elevator descended past the basement level he'd expected, continuing down into spaces that seemed to have been carved from solid rock rather than constructed with conventional building techniques. Sub-basement 3 was a single corridor lined with steel doors, each one secured with locks that belonged on bank vaults rather than office storage rooms. The air was cool and dry, maintained by climate control systems that hummed softly in the background, and the walls showed the kind of reinforcement used in facilities designed to survive earthquakes, explosions, or other catastrophes that might collapse ordinary buildings. Marcus tried several of the vault doors, but they were all locked, sealed with mechanisms that looked like they required special keys or combination codes that he didn't have. Whatever was stored down here was important enough to protect with serious security, expensive enough to justify the elaborate climate control systems, and secret enough to hide 3 levels underground in a building that was supposed to contain nothing more interesting than empty offices. "Daddy, this feels like a secret base," Daniel said, his voice echoing in the concrete corridor with the kind of excitement that children brought to discoveries that might be dangerous, but were definitely interesting. Marcus had to agree. This wasn't the basement of an ordinary office building. This was infrastructure designed for activities that required both security and secrecy, built by people who had resources and reasons for hiding things from public view. They returned to the main floors and continued their exploration, but Marcus found it difficult to concentrate on renovation plans when his mind kept returning to the vault doors and the mysterious office with its sophisticated communication equipment. The building was revealing itself to be far more complex than a simple inheritance, more significant than a piece of commercial real estate that had been forgotten by time and economics. By afternoon, Marcus had filled a notebook with measurements and observations, but he'd also compiled a growing list of questions that had no obvious answers. Why was someone still paying the electric bill on an abandoned building? Who had installed the communication equipment in the 7th floor office? What was hidden behind the vault doors in sub-basement 3? And why did the whole place feel like it was waiting for something? Like a mechanism that had been wound up and left ticking until someone came along with the right key. Daniel had adapted to their exploration with the resilience that children showed when their world changed faster than adults thought possible. He'd claimed a corner of the 15th floor executive suite as his base of operations, spreading out his Lego blocks and building elaborate structures that incorporated architectural elements he'd observed during their tour of the building. "Look, Daddy," Daniel said, pointing to a Lego construction that featured underground levels connected to upper floors by what looked like a miniature elevator system. "I'm building our new house like the real building, with secret rooms and everything. Marcus knelt beside his son's creation, impressed by the attention to detail that a 7-year-old had brought to reproducing the building's unusual features. "What do you think the secret rooms are for?" Daniel considered the question with the seriousness that children brought to important matters of imagination and possibility. "Maybe they're for keeping treasure safe. Or maybe they're for hiding from bad guys who want to steal the treasure." "What kind of treasure?" "The kind that helps good guys help other good guys," Daniel said, rearranging a few Lego pieces to better represent whatever vision he had in mind. "Like Batman's cave, but for regular people who want to do good things." Marcus smiled despite the growing unease that had been building in his chest all day. His son's interpretation of their mysterious inheritance was probably closer to the truth than any rational explanation Marcus could construct. The building felt like it had been designed by people who understood that sometimes good work required operating in shadows, protecting valuable things from those who would misuse them. At 7:30 that evening, Marcus left Daniel at the motel with strict instructions not to open the door for anyone, and drove back to the building through empty streets that seemed to hold more shadows than usual. The autumn darkness was complete now, broken only by scattered streetlights that cast long pools of illumination across the industrial landscape like spotlights on a stage where no one was performing. Room 1512 was on the top floor, in what had once been the executive suite, where corner offices offered panoramic views of the surrounding countryside. Marcus took the stairs rather than trust the elevator, his footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell like a countdown to something important, and found the door unlocked and slightly open. Inside, a small man in his 60s sat behind a desk that had been cleared of everything except a single manila folder and a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool air. He stood when Marcus entered, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to waste no motion, and extended a hand that felt like leather wrapped around steel cable. "Mr. Rivera, thank you for coming. My name is David Kingston. I've been waiting to meet you for a very long time." Kingston was perhaps 5'6", with silver hair combed straight back and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of whatever they observed. His suit looked expensive but worn, like something bought for important occasions but used for everyday work. And when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without having to raise his voice or make threats. Marcus remained standing, his hands loose at his sides but ready for whatever might develop. Years of construction work had taught him to read situations quickly, to recognize when a conversation might turn physical, and something about Kingston suggested a man who had handled violence professionally and recently enough to remember how it was done. "You've been in my building," Marcus said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Yes," Kingston replied simply, as if trespassing was something that required no explanation or apology. "Your building, but my responsibility. Please, sit down. There's a great deal I need to tell you, and not much time to explain it properly." Marcus took the chair across from the desk but didn't relax, keeping his feet flat on the floor and his weight forward in case he needed to move quickly. "Start with why you're here. Start with why the lights are on in a building that's supposed to be empty." Kingston opened the manila folder and withdrew a photograph that looked like it had been taken decades earlier, when color film was expensive and photographs were events that people dressed up for. It showed a much younger version of himself standing beside an elegant woman with dark hair and serious eyes who looked like she'd spent her life making decisions that other people had to live with. Marcus recognized the woman immediately, though he'd only seen her once and she'd been much older then. It was Sarah's grandmother, But this picture had been taken when she was young and vital, and standing close to Kingston, like they shared secrets that no one else was allowed to understand. "Elena Vasquez was my partner," Kingston said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been love, or might have been professional respect, or might have been both. "Not romantically, though we cared for each other deeply, professionally. We built this place together in 1978, ostensibly as a development company headquarters. In reality, it was designed for a very different purpose." Marcus studied the photograph, seeing now the resemblance between the woman in the picture and his late wife, understanding for the first time that Sarah had inherited more than her grandmother's eyes and stubborn chin. She'd inherited a legacy of secrets that Marcus was only beginning to comprehend. "What kind of purpose?" Marcus asked. "The kind that saved lives," Kingston said, withdrawing another document from the folder. "The kind that powerful people wanted to forget, but that Elena refused to abandon. She left this building to your wife, because she knew Sarah would understand its value. But Sarah died before she could claim her inheritance, before she could learn what Elena had prepared for her." The document was a blueprint, but unlike any architectural drawing Marcus had seen in 15 years of construction work. It showed the building's structure in detail, but it also revealed features that hadn't been visible during his exploration. Additional sub-basements that extended deep underground, reinforced chambers that looked like they'd been designed to survive nuclear attacks, and ventilation systems that were far too elaborate for an ordinary office building. "What is this place?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "It was a sanctuary," Kingston said, leaning back in his chair, like a man preparing to tell a long story that he'd been keeping to himself for too many years. During the Cold War, when rational people understood that civilization could end with the turn of a key, certain individuals took steps to ensure that something would survive. Elena was one of those people. She used her family's resources to create places where important things could be protected when the world went insane. Kingston stood and walked to the window, looking out over the darkened landscape like a general surveying a battlefield that had been quiet for decades, but could explode into violence again without warning. Elena's family came from old money, the kind that traced back to land grants and mining rights and investments that had been compounding interest since before the Civil War. But she wasn't content to live on inherited wealth without purpose. She believed that prosperity came with responsibility, that those who had much should protect those who had little. Marcus thought about Sarah's grandmother, remembering the severe woman who had sat in the back pew at their wedding, like a guardian of traditions that younger generations had forgotten. He'd assumed her silence came from disapproval, but now he wondered if it had come from the burden of carrying secrets too important to share with people who might not understand their significance. When the nuclear threat was at its peak, during the late 70s and early 80s, Elena used her resources to create sanctuaries like this one, Kingston continued, places where families could disappear if the political situation deteriorated, where documents and records could be preserved if conventional institutions collapsed, where wealth could be protected against economic chaos or government seizure. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's temperature. "You're talking about preparing for the end of the world." "We were preparing for the possibility that powerful people might destroy the world to protect their own interests," Kingston corrected. Elena understood that governments could fall, that economic systems could collapse, that the rule of law could disappear overnight if enough pressure was applied in the right places. She built this facility to ensure that something would survive. The older man returned to his seat and opened another folder. This one, containing newspaper clippings, court documents, and photographs of men in expensive suits who looked like they'd spent their lives accumulating power and using it to crush anyone who stood in their way. By 1985, it became clear that the nuclear threat was receding, but other dangers had emerged, Kingston said. Corruption in government and business, the kind that destroyed communities like Millbrook. Economic warfare, waged by people who saw entire towns as nothing more than resources to be exploited and discarded. Elena began using this facility for a different purpose. Marcus was beginning to understand, but he needed to hear it confirmed by someone who had been there when the decisions were made. She began collecting evidence, Marcus said. She began documenting crimes, Kingston corrected. Financial records, recorded conversations, photographs, video surveillance. Proof of activities that would never see the inside of a courtroom because the perpetrators were too wealthy or too well connected to face justice through conventional legal channels. Kingston leaned forward, his eyes bright with something that might have been pride or might have been the satisfaction of someone who had spent decades pursuing a mission that finally had a chance to succeed. Elena understood that the legal system works perfectly well when it has accurate information and honest participants. Her job was to provide the information and neutralize the dishonest participants, regardless of how much money they had or how many lawyers they could afford to hire. Marcus thought about the vault doors in Sub-Basement 3, about the communication equipment in the 7th floor office, about the building's elaborate security features that made no sense for a conventional commercial property. The basement levels. That's where she kept everything. Fireproof, waterproof, climate-controlled storage for documents, and recordings that could destroy careers and topple governments, Kingston confirmed. Elena called it her insurance policy against the powerful, preying on the weak, her guarantee that justice would eventually prevail, even if it took decades to arrange. The implications began to sink in, and Marcus felt a growing understanding of why this building existed, why it had been maintained in secret for so many years, and why someone like Kingston had been waiting for the right person to inherit Elena's legacy. "You're telling me that Sarah's grandmother was some kind of vigilante," Marcus said. "I'm telling you that Elena Vasquez was a woman who refused to accept that wealth and power placed anyone above the law," Kingston replied. "She spent 40 years documenting the crimes of people who thought they were untouchable, and she used that documentation to ensure they faced consequences for their actions." Marcus leaned back in his chair, trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about his wife's family history. Sarah had never mentioned her grandmother's activities, had never suggested that their family tree included anyone more interesting than farmers and small business owners, who had worked hard and saved their money and lived quiet lives that didn't attract government attention. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. "Why not just keep running things the way you have been?" "Because I'm 73 years old," Kingston said simply. "Because Elena trusted your wife's judgment, and Sarah trusted yours. Because the work isn't finished, and someone needs to carry it forward." Kingston reached into the folder one final time and withdrew an object that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. It was a key, old-fashioned and heavy, made of brass that had been polished smooth by decades of handling. Even without touching it, Marcus could tell that it was important, that it opened something significant enough to justify all the secrecy and elaborate security that surrounded this building. "This opens the main vault on Sub-Basement 3, Kingston said, placing the key on the desk between them, like a chess piece being moved into position for checkmate. "Inside, you'll find Elena's complete files, her financial records, her evidence archives, and her final instructions for whoever inherited her mission. Marcus stared at the key without touching it, understanding that once he picked it up, his life would change in ways he couldn't predict or control. "There's something else," Kingston continued. "Something that Elena recovered during her final case. Money that belongs to people who lost everything when powerful criminals decided their community wasn't worth protecting." "How much money?" Marcus asked. $240 million in cash, gold, and bearer bonds," Kingston said, quietly. "The proceeds from the largest pension theft in Pennsylvania history. Money that was stolen from 10,000 workers and hidden in offshore accounts until Elena's investigation located it and brought it home." Marcus felt the world shift around him, reality rearranging itself into patterns he'd never imagined possible. $240 million. More money than he could have conceived of. Enough to solve every problem he'd ever had and provide security for Daniel that would last generations. But he was beginning to understand that Elena's legacy wasn't really about money. It was about responsibility, about the choice between using power to protect others or to protect yourself, about deciding whether justice was worth pursuing when the cost might be higher than you were prepared to pay. "What if I just want to sell the building and walk away?" Marcus asked. Kingston smiled sadly, like a teacher watching a promising student struggle with a concept that should have been obvious. "Then you're not the man Elena believed you to be," Kingston said. "And more importantly, you're not the man your son needs you to be." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows with cold gusts that spoke of winter's approach and changes that couldn't be stopped or delayed. Marcus thought about Daniel asleep in the motel room, clutching his stuffed elephant and trusting his father to make decisions that would shape both their futures. He thought about Sarah's final words, about things she hadn't been able to tell him, secrets that had died with her but lived on in brass keys and hidden vaults and buildings that held more than they appeared to contain. Most of all, he thought about the choice he was being offered, to walk away from complexity and danger and responsibility, or to step forward into a world where ordinary people could hold powerful criminals accountable for their actions, where justice was possible even when the legal system had been corrupted or intimidated into silence. "How long do I have to decide?" Marcus asked. Kingston's expression grew serious, and for the first time since the conversation began, Marcus saw something that looked like concern in the older man's eyes. "Elena's final case involved some very powerful people," Kingston said. "People who have spent the last 2 years trying to find this facility and destroy the evidence it contains. They know you're here now, know you've inherited Elena's legacy. They'll move against you soon, probably within the next few days." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. "Are you saying they'll try to hurt us?" "I'm saying they'll try to eliminate any threat to their freedom and financial security," Kingston replied. "These aren't people who negotiate or compromise. They're people who remove obstacles, permanently and without remorse." Kingston stood and pulled on a coat that had been draped over the back of his chair, preparing to leave Marcus alone with the most important decision of his life. "There's one more thing you should know," Kingston said, pausing at the door. "Your wife knew about this place, knew what her grandmother had been doing. Elena contacted Sarah 6 months before she died, tried to explain the legacy she was leaving and what it would mean to whoever inherited it. Sarah was planning to visit, to learn what Elena wanted to teach her." Marcus felt something tight and painful in his chest, the familiar ache of loss mixed with the sharp surprise of learning that Sarah had been carrying secrets even at the end. The cancer took her before she could make the trip, Kingston continued. But she wanted you to know that if anything happened to her, if Elena's legacy fell to you, she trusted you to make the right choice. After Kingston left, Marcus sat alone in the executive suite, turning the brass key over in his hands like a talisman that might reveal its secrets if he studied it long enough. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the lights of Millbrook spread out below, a small constellation of lives that continued their quiet routines, unaware of the storm that was gathering around them. He thought about Elena Vasquez, a woman he'd met only once, but who had somehow shaped the trajectory of his life from beyond the grave. He thought about Sarah, carrying the weight of family secrets, even as her own life slipped away. He thought about Daniel, sleeping peacefully in a motel room, trusting his father to make choices that would protect him from dangers he didn't understand. But mostly, he thought about the key in his hand and what it represented. Not just access to unimaginable wealth, but entry into a world where justice was pursued by any means necessary, where powerful people were held accountable for their crimes, regardless of their position or influence or ability to hire the best lawyers money could buy. It was a world that Sarah's grandmother had built with her own hands and resources, a legacy of resistance against those who used their power to harm others rather than help them. It was dangerous work, the kind that made enemies among people who had unlimited resources for revenge. But it was also necessary work, the kind that made the difference between a world where might made right and a world where right had a chance to prevail. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking down at his pickup truck in the empty parking lot. He could load Daniel into that truck in the morning, drive back to Phoenix, and try to rebuild their lives from whatever pieces remained after Sarah's death. And his unemployment and the slow erosion of hope that came with watching the bills pile up faster than solutions could be found. It would be the safe choice, the rational choice, the decision that any reasonable person would make when confronted with the option of walking away from danger and complexity and responsibility that belonged to someone else. Or he could walk down to sub-basement 3, turn the brass key in its lock, and step into Elena Vasquez's world of secrets and justice and consequences that powerful people had spent their lives trying to avoid. The choice, Marcus realized, wasn't really about the money, or the building, or even Elena's legacy. It was about who he wanted to be, and what kind of father he wanted Daniel to remember when the story of their lives was finally told. It was about courage, the kind that Sarah had tried to teach their son before the cancer took her voice away, the kind that said doing right was more important than staying safe, that protecting others mattered more than protecting yourself, that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were terrible and the outcome was uncertain. Marcus closed his eyes and made his decision. Tomorrow, he would discover what Elena Vasquez had hidden in the depths of her fortress, what she had been protecting for 40 years, and what kind of enemies he was about to make by choosing justice over safety. Tonight, he would drive back to the motel and hold his sleeping son and prepare for a future that would be more dangerous and more meaningful than anything he'd ever imagined possible. The key felt warm in his palm, heavy with possibility and responsibility in equal measure. Tomorrow, everything would change. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He lay in the lumpy motel bed listening to Daniel's steady breathing and staring at the water-stained ceiling, the brass key warm in his palm where he'd been clutching it like a rosary bead. Every few minutes, he would look over at his son's peaceful face and feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. heavier than any load he'd ever carried on a construction site. By dawn, he had made up his mind, though the choice felt less like deciding and more like accepting what had already been determined by forces beyond his control. Sarah's grandmother hadn't left him this inheritance by accident. Kingston hadn't waited 40 years to meet him by chance. Daniel hadn't spoken about heroes and helping people by coincidence. Everything had been leading to this moment, when an ordinary man would have to choose between the safety of anonymity and the danger of doing what was right. He woke Daniel gently and made breakfast from supplies he'd bought at a convenience store. Instant oatmeal heated with bottled water and a camping stove that filled the motel room with the smell of propane and simple contentment. It wasn't much, but Daniel didn't complain. The boy seemed to sense that something important was happening, something that required patience and trust, and the kind of quiet courage that children often displayed better than adults. "Daddy," Daniel said, as Marcus cleaned up their simple meal, "are we going to open the secret door today?" Marcus paused in his cleaning, struck once again by his son's ability to cut through complexity and reach the heart of things that adults made complicated. "How did you know there was a secret door?" Daniel shrugged with the casual certainty of childhood logic. "All the best places have secret doors. And yesterday you looked like you found something important but scary. Like when I found that big spider in my room, but didn't want to touch it." Marcus knelt beside his son's chair and looked into the brown eyes that reminded him so much of Sarah's. What if the secret door leads somewhere dangerous? Daniel considered this with the gravity he brought to all important questions. "Then we'll be careful." "But Daddy, what if it leads somewhere that can help people? Wouldn't it be worse not to look?" The wisdom of children, Marcus thought, often came disguised as simple questions that revealed complicated truths. His 7-year-old son understood something that grown men spent years learning: that avoiding danger wasn't always the same thing as making the right choice. After breakfast, Marcus called Kingston and arranged to meet in the building. He wanted to examine Elena's files before he opened the main vault, to understand exactly what kind of evidence she had gathered and what it would mean to possess it. If he was going to step into her world of secrets and justice, he needed to know what enemies he would be making and what weapons they might use against him. The building felt different in the morning light that filtered down through its central well, less like a tomb and more like a fortress that had been waiting for its garrison to return. Marcus and Daniel descended to sub-basement 3 in the freight elevator, the brass key heavy in Marcus's pocket, as they approached the corridor lined with vault doors that looked like they belonged in the Federal Reserve rather than an abandoned office building. Kingston was waiting for them beside the door, marked E.V. Archive, carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who was about to reveal secrets he'd been keeping for decades. He nodded to Marcus with the formality of someone transferring a sacred responsibility, then knelt to Daniel's level with the patience of a grandfather. "Young man," Kingston said seriously, "what we're about to show your father is very important, but it might also be frightening. Are you brave enough to help us protect something valuable?" Daniel straightened his shoulders and nodded with the solemnity of a soldier accepting a mission. "I'm brave enough." Marcus inserted Elena's brass key into the vault lock and turned it slowly, feeling the mechanism disengage with a series of clicks that sounded like a combination safe opening in reverse. The heavy door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a room that took his breath away and made him understand, for the first time, the true scope of what Sarah's grandmother had been doing for 40 years. The vault was enormous, its walls lined with filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling, like a library designed by someone who collected secrets instead of books. Climate control systems hummed softly in the background, maintaining the precise temperature and humidity needed to preserve documents that could destroy governments and topple dynasties. Computer servers stood in temperature-controlled cases, their lights blinking with the steady rhythm of electronic heartbeats, maintaining digital archives that complemented the paper records surrounding them. And in the center of the room, arranged on tables like an art exhibition of American currency, were stacks of bills, gold bars, and bearer bonds that represented more wealth than Marcus had ever imagined seeing in one place. The money was organized with the methodical precision of someone who understood that $240 million wasn't just a number. It was the stolen future of 10,000 families, the life savings of workers who had trusted their employers and been betrayed by criminals who viewed other people's security as their own opportunity. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, the profanity slipping out before he could stop it. "Daddy said a bad word," Daniel observed, with the matter-of-fact accuracy of a child who had learned that adults sometimes said things they weren't supposed to say when they were surprised or scared or overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. Marcus walked slowly through the vault, his work boots silent on the polished concrete floor, running his fingers along the filing cabinets that contained decades of Elena's investigations. Each drawer was labeled with case numbers and dates, a methodical catalogue of justice pursued outside the legal system by a woman who had refused to accept that wealth and power placed anyone above the law. Some of the names on the files were familiar. Politicians and businessmen who had fallen from grace in spectacular fashion over the years, their careers destroyed by scandals that had seemed to emerge from nowhere, but now revealed themselves as the fruit of Elena's patient work. Corporate executives who had suddenly resigned in disgrace. Judges who had quietly retired rather than face impeachment. Lobbyists who had disappeared from Washington after decades of wielding influence like a weapon. Kingston followed Marcus through the vault, his voice carrying the pride of someone who had spent his life building something important, something that mattered more than personal profit or professional advancement. 40 years of work, Kingston said quietly. 40 years of documenting crimes that would have gone unpunished, recovering stolen assets that would have stayed hidden, ensuring that justice prevailed even when the legal system was too corrupt or intimidated to function properly. Marcus stopped in front of a particular filing cabinet, labeled Millbrook Industrial, Final Case, and felt a chill of recognition. The label was dated 2 years ago, shortly before Elena's death, and the thickness of the files suggested an investigation that had consumed months of intensive work. "This is about Millbrook," Marcus said. "About what happened to this town." "Elena's final case," Kingston confirmed. "The one she died before completing. The one that would have exposed the biggest financial conspiracy in Pennsylvania history." Marcus opened the filing cabinet and withdrew a folder that contained hundreds of documents, financial records, email printouts, photographs, recorded conversations, transcribed word for word. It was a complete picture of how a group of wealthy investors had systematically destroyed Millbrook's industrial base, bankrupting profitable companies and stealing their employees' pension funds with the casual efficiency of people who had turned economic predation into a science. The conspiracy was breathtaking in its scope and callousness. Starting in 2018, a consortium of investors, led by a man named Charles Westfield, had begun acquiring controlling interests in Millbrook's largest employers: the steel plant, the chemical facility, the tool and die shops that had provided good-paying jobs for 3 generations of local families. On paper, they were bringing new capital and modern management to aging industries. In reality, They were implementing a looting scheme that would make them wealthy while destroying the lives of everyone who depended on those companies for their survival. The process was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its impact. The new management would declare financial emergencies that required temporary loans from the employee pension funds to keep the companies operational. The money would be transferred to offshore accounts controlled by the consortium, then invested in complex financial instruments that generated enormous profits for the conspirators, while leaving the pension funds holding worthless paper. When the scheme finally collapsed, as it was always designed to do, the companies would declare bankruptcy, the pension funds would be empty, and 10,000 workers would find themselves unemployed and financially ruined. The criminals would walk away with $240 million in stolen retirement savings, while their victims faced poverty, foreclosure, and the destruction of everything they had worked their entire lives to build. Marcus read through the files with growing anger, seeing in the clinical language of financial documents the human cost of white-collar crime that destroyed communities with the same efficiency as natural disasters, but none of the random tragedy that made such losses easier to wise. Except, these weren't accidents or market forces or economic inevitabilities. They were crimes, deliberate and calculated, committed by people who viewed entire towns as nothing more than resources to be exploited and discarded. They stole everything, Marcus said, his voice tight with fury. They took the pensions, bankrupted the companies, destroyed the whole town. Elena documented it all, Kingston said. Every transaction, every secret meeting, every offshore account. She had enough evidence to put the entire conspiracy in prison for the rest of their lives. Marcus found Elena's handwritten notes in the back of the file, observations and analysis written in the careful script of someone who understood that details mattered when you were building cases against people with unlimited resources for legal defense. The money was hidden in 23 different accounts. Marcus read aloud from Elena's notes. 17 offshore banks, 6 domestic institutions. Recovery required cooperation from authorities in 8 countries, and manipulation of currency markets in 3. Total recovered, $240,300,000. Daniel had wandered over to the stacks of currency and was studying them with the fascination that children brought to things they'd heard about but never seen. "Daddy, is this all the money the bad guys stole?" "Yes, buddy. Elena found it and brought it home. Are we going to give it back to the people they stole it from?" Marcus looked at Kingston, who was watching this exchange with something that might have been approval or might have been concern. "That's what Elena intended," Kingston said. "But she died before she could complete the distribution. The money has been sitting here for 2 years, waiting for someone to carry out her final wishes." Marcus closed the file and looked around the vault at the evidence of 4 decades of work, the accumulated proof of crimes that would otherwise have gone unpunished, wealth that would otherwise have stayed hidden, justice that would otherwise have been denied to people who couldn't afford to hire lawyers or buy politicians or threaten judges. "How many people know about this place?" Marcus asked. "Very few," Kingston said. Elena was careful about security, but Charles Westfield and his associates have been searching for this evidence since her death. They know it exists, know it could destroy them, and they've been getting more desperate as time passes. As if summoned by his words, the sound of vehicles echoed down from the upper levels of the building. Car doors slamming, voices carrying the authority of people who expected their orders to be obeyed. Footsteps moving with the coordinated precision of a tactical team entering a potentially hostile environment. Kingston's expression changed from informative to urgent. "They're here." Westfield must have been watching the building. Marcus felt ice in his veins as he realized that Daniel was trapped with him in a vault, 3 levels underground, while armed men searched the building above them. "How many ways out of here?" "2, Kingston said, moving toward a control panel mounted near the vault entrance. "The elevator we used, and an emergency exit that connects to the storm drain system." "But Marcus, if they've found this place, if they know you're here..." "Running won't solve the problem." The sound of voices was getting closer, echoing down the elevator shaft like hunting calls from predators who had finally located their prey. Marcus could hear orders being given, areas being secured, the building being methodically searched by people who knew exactly what they were looking for and were prepared to kill anyone who stood between them and Elena's evidence. "Who are these people?" Marcus asked. "Westfield's security contractors," Kingston said. "Former military, former intelligence, the kind of men who eliminate problems that can't be solved through legal channels." Marcus thought about the threats Kingston had described, about powerful people who removed obstacles permanently and without remorse. He thought about Daniel, 7 years old, and trusting his father to keep him safe, and felt a fury building in his chest that was colder and more focused than any anger he'd ever experienced. "They can't have this," Marcus said, gesturing toward the evidence that filled the vault. "They can't be allowed to destroy what Elena spent 40 years building." "Then you need to decide," Kingston said quietly. "Right now, walk away and hope they let you live, or stay and fight for something bigger than yourself." The elevator was moving, descending towards sub-basement 3, with mechanical groaning that sounded like a countdown to violence. Marcus had perhaps 2 minutes before armed men reached the vault. 2 minutes to decide whether he was going to run or stand, whether he was going to protect himself or protect Elena's legacy. He looked at Daniel, who was watching the adults with the wide-eyed alertness of a child who understood that something dangerous was happening, but trusted his father to handle it. His son deserved safety, deserved a life free from the kind of violence that came with challenging powerful criminals, deserved a father who chose prudence over heroics. But Daniel also deserved justice for the people who had been robbed, deserved a world where criminals faced consequences for their actions, deserved a father who stood up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. Marcus made his decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next, understanding that some choices couldn't be postponed or delegated or reconsidered when conditions improved. "Kingston," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear and anger warring in his chest. "Is there a way to broadcast Elena's evidence? To get it to law enforcement and media simultaneously?" Kingston smiled with the grim satisfaction of someone who had been waiting years for the right moment to deploy weapons he'd been keeping in reserve. "Elena built this facility with multiple redundancies. Everything in this vault has been digitized and stored on servers in 3 different countries. With the right codes, I can release it all to prosecutors, journalists, and regulatory agencies within minutes." The elevator had reached their level, and Marcus could hear the distinctive sound of tactical gear and automatic weapons being readied for deployment. Professional killers were preparing to enter the vault, and they wouldn't hesitate to murder a construction worker and his 7-year-old son if that's what it took to protect their employer's secrets. "Daniel," Marcus said, kneeling beside his son and speaking with the calm authority he used when teaching the boy about power tools and construction safety. "I need you to go with Mr. Say, Kingston to the emergency exit. Can you do that for me?" Daniel looked into his father's eyes and saw something there, that made him straighten his shoulders with the courage he'd inherited from both parents. "What about you, Daddy?" "I'm going to talk to the bad guys," Marcus said. "I'm going to make sure they understand that Eleanor's work is going to continue, no matter what they do to try to stop it." "Mr. Rivera," Kingston said urgently, "these aren't people who negotiate. They're here to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence." "Then they're going to be disappointed," Marcus said, standing and walking toward the vault entrance. "Because the evidence is already beyond their reach, and the witnesses aren't going to stay quiet." The elevator doors opened with a mechanical whisper, and 3 men in tactical gear stepped into the corridor with weapons raised and eyes that scanned for threats, with the automatic precision of people who had done this many times before. Behind them came a 4th man, older and better dressed, wearing the kind of expensive suit that suggested authority backed by unlimited financial resources. Marcus recognized him immediately from Elena's files. Charles Westfield, the architect of the Millbrook conspiracy, the man who had stolen $240 million from 10,000 workers, and thought he had gotten away with it. He was tall and silver-haired, carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions and couldn't imagine circumstances where that might change. "Mr. Rivera," Westfield said, his voice carrying the false courtesy of someone delivering an ultimatum. "I believe you have something that belongs to my associates and me." Marcus stepped out of the vault and into the corridor, making sure his body blocked Westfield's view of the evidence inside. "I have a lot of things. You'll need to be more specific." Westfield's smile was as cold as winter in Pennsylvania. "Don't play games with me. Elena Vasquez stole assets that my consortium legitimately acquired through proper legal channels. We're here to recover our property." "You mean the pension money you stole from 10,000 workers?" Marcus asked. "The life savings you looted when you bankrupted their companies? That property? I mean assets that were legally transferred to accounts under our management," Westfield said smoothly. "Elena Vasquez was a criminal who used illegal methods to appropriate funds that didn't belong to her." Marcus looked at the security contractors, noting their positions and weapon readiness, calculating odds that weren't in his favor, but weren't hopeless either. "And if I don't cooperate with your recovery efforts?" Westfield's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his gray eyes, like ice forming on still water. "Then you'll discover that accidents happen with unfortunate frequency to people who interfere with legitimate business operations. Your son is 7 years old, I believe. Such a vulnerable age. So many things could go wrong." The threat against Daniel shattered Marcus's restraint like a hammer hitting glass. He took a step toward Westfield, his hands clenching into fists that had been hardened by 15 years of construction work. But one of the security contractors moved to intercept him with the fluid precision of someone trained to kill with his bare hands if necessary. "I wouldn't," Westfield said calmly. "Violence would only make things worse for everyone involved." Marcus forced himself to stop, but his voice carried all the fury he was holding back, all the protective rage of a father hearing his child threatened by criminals who thought their money made them untouchable. "If you hurt my son," Marcus said quietly, "there won't be enough money in the world to buy you the kind of protection you'll need." Westfield laughed, a sound like breaking glass in a quiet room. "Empty threats from desperate men. The question is whether you're intelligent enough to recognize reality. My consortium controls assets worth billions of dollars. We employ the best lawyers, the most effective security firms, the most influential politicians. You're a construction worker with no resources and no connections. What possible chance do you think you have? Against us, Marcus looked around the concrete corridor, at the vault doors that protected 40 years of Elena's work, at the evidence that could destroy Westfield and his associates if it ever saw the light of day. And suddenly, he understood something that Westfield couldn't see: the difference between having power and being powerful. "You want to know what chance I have?" Marcus asked. "I have the chance that comes from being right. I have the chance that comes from fighting for something that matters instead of just fighting for money. I have Elena Vasquez's evidence, and I have the courage to use it." Westfield's smile faded. "Evidence that will never see a courtroom. Evidence that will be destroyed along with anyone foolish enough to try to preserve it." "Actually," said a new voice from the direction of the emergency exit, "the evidence has already been transmitted to federal prosecutors in 3 states and investigative journalists at 5 major newspapers. By tomorrow morning, your conspiracy will be front-page news." Kingston emerged from the shadows with Daniel beside him, both of them moving with the confidence of people who had just executed a plan that had been years in the making. In Kingston's hand was a tablet computer showing transmission confirmation logs, proof that Elena's files had been uploaded to secure servers and distributed to law enforcement agencies that couldn't be bought or intimidated. Westfield stared at the tablet like it was a weapon aimed at his heart. "That's impossible. We've been monitoring electronic communications. Nothing was transmitted. Elena built this facility with satellite uplinks that bypass conventional communication networks," Kingston said with satisfaction. "Military-grade encryption, multiple redundant channels, transmission protocols that your people have never seen before. Everything is already beyond your reach." For the first time since entering the vault level, Westfield looked uncertain, his confidence shaken by the realization that he was no longer in control of the situation. "You have no idea what you've started. My associates won't allow this information to become public." "Your associates don't have a choice," Marcus said. "The evidence is already public. By noon tomorrow, federal agents will be executing arrest warrants. By evening, your stolen money will be frozen in accounts around the world." Westfield turned to his security contractors, and Marcus saw something dangerous in his expression: the look of a man who had decided that if he couldn't win, he would at least eliminate the witnesses who had defeated him. "Kill them," Westfield said simply. "All of them." The security contractors raised their weapons, and Marcus stepped in front of Daniel with the instinctive movement of a father protecting his child, knowing he was too late but unable to do anything else. Time seemed to slow as fingers tightened on triggers, and Marcus realized he was about to die for the crime of standing up to people who thought their wealth placed them above justice. Then the corridor exploded with light and sound as federal agents in tactical gear burst through both the elevator and emergency exits simultaneously, their weapons trained on Westfield's men with the precision of people who had been planning this operation for months. "Federal agents, drop your weapons." The security contractors found themselves surrounded and outgunned, facing the choice between surrender and a firefight they couldn't win. One by one, they lowered their weapons and raised their hands, professional enough to recognize when resistance was futile. Westfield stared around the corridor in disbelief, understanding finally that he had walked into a trap that had been set by people who were better at planning than he was at scheming. "Charles Westfield," said the lead federal agent, a tall woman with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had spent her career building cases against people who thought they were too powerful to prosecute. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and threatening federal witnesses." As the agents led Westfield and his men away in handcuffs, Marcus knelt beside Daniel and pulled his son into his arms. breathing in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood resilience. "Daddy," Daniel said, his voice muffled against Marcus's shoulder. "Were those the good guys who came to help us?" "Yes, buddy," Marcus said, his voice shaking with relief and exhaustion. "Those were the good guys." Daniel pulled back and looked into his father's eyes with the serious expression he wore when he was trying to understand something important. "Does this mean we won?" Marcus looked around the corridor at the evidence of Elena's 40-year mission, at the vault full of documents that would ensure justice for crimes that might otherwise have been forgotten, at the money that would be returned to families who had lost everything to criminals who thought they were untouchable. "Yeah," Marcus said softly. "I think this means we won." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus understood that victory was just the beginning. Westfield's arrest would trigger investigations that spread across multiple states and countries, unraveling a web of corruption that reached into places Marcus couldn't imagine. There would be trials and testimony, threats and attempts at retaliation, years of legal proceedings that would reshape how financial crimes were prosecuted and punished. Elena Vasquez's work was far from finished. It had just found new hands to carry it forward, new voices to speak for justice, new courage to stand against those who used their power to harm rather than help. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Outside the building, dawn was breaking over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that promised a new day for a town that had waited too long for justice. And in the depths of Elena's fortress, a construction worker and his 7-year-old son stood among the evidence that would restore the stolen dreams of 10,000 families, understanding finally that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they decided that doing right was more important than staying safe. The real work was just beginning. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same conference room where Charles Westfield had threatened his son. But everything about the space had changed beyond recognition. The walls were lined with photographs of Millbrook's industrial history, images of proud workers and thriving factories from the decades when the town had been a beacon of American manufacturing prosperity. The conference table, where Daniel's Lego City had been scattered by criminals who thought children's dreams were obstacles to their greed, now held architectural plans for the Millbrook Community Center, a project funded by the recovered pension money, and designed to restore hope to a community that had almost forgotten what it felt like. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Marcus could see construction crews working on the building's exterior, replacing broken windows that had stared blindly at the town's decline for decades, and cleaning the concrete facade until it gleamed like new hope in the Pennsylvania sunlight. The parking lot, that had once been empty except for weeds and broken promises, now bustled with activity. Federal investigators finishing their work, contractors beginning renovations that would transform the building into something the community could be proud of, and townspeople arriving for the weekly meetings that had become Marcus's new responsibility. Daniel sat at a smaller table beside his father's desk, working on homework assignments from the Millbrook Elementary School, where he'd enrolled 3 months ago. His Lego creations had evolved too, becoming more sophisticated architectural models that sometimes found their way into Marcus's renovation plans. When the boy's imagination suggested solutions that trained engineers had overlooked, Daniel had inherited his mother's eye for design and his father's understanding of how things fit together. but he'd also developed something uniquely his own. The confidence that came from watching his father choose courage over comfort. "Daddy," Daniel said, looking up from his math worksheet with the serious expression he wore when he was processing something important. "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can come speak to our class about being a hero." Marcus smiled. Despite the weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders, like a construction worker's tool belt, heavy but necessary. Mrs. Patterson was Daniel's second-grade teacher, a woman in her 60s who had lost her husband's pension in the Westfield conspiracy and had spent 2 years wondering how she would survive retirement on Social Security alone. She was also one of the most vocal advocates for the community programs that Marcus was developing with Elena's recovered funds, a living example of how justice delayed was not justice denied when the right people finally had the courage to act. "I'm not sure I'm the best person to talk about being a hero," Marcus said, though he understood now that heroism wasn't about being the best person for the job. It was about being the person willing to do the job when everyone else found reasons to look away. "But you caught the bad guys," Daniel insisted, with the logical certainty of childhood. "And you're giving everyone their money back. That's what heroes do, isn't it?" Marcus considered this, thinking about the letters that arrived daily from people whose lives had been destroyed by the Westfield conspiracy and were slowly being rebuilt by the return of their stolen pensions. Workers who had lost their retirement savings and found them restored with interest. Families who had been forced from their homes and could now buy them back. Children who had seen their college funds disappear and could now plan for futures that included education and opportunity. "Heroes work together," Marcus said finally, remembering the lesson that Elena Vasquez had spent 40 years teaching through her example. No one person can fix everything alone. It takes a whole community of people who decide that doing right is more important than doing easy. He was thinking of Kingston, who had become his partner in managing Elena's legacy and ensuring that her methods for pursuing justice continued to evolve and improve. He was thinking of the federal prosecutors who had built airtight cases against Westfield's conspiracy, working 18-hour days to ensure that powerful criminals faced the same consequences as ordinary lawbreakers. He was thinking of the townspeople who had embraced the community center project and made it their own, volunteering their time and skills to build something that belonged to all of them. Most of all, he was thinking of Elena Vasquez herself, whose photograph now hung in the lobby of what was being renamed the Elena Vasquez Justice Center. The severe woman Marcus had met once at his wedding had been revealed as something far more complex. A guardian of the vulnerable, a hunter of corrupt power, a woman who had used her wealth and position to ensure that justice prevailed even when the legal system had been corrupted or intimidated into silence. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Kingston entered, carrying a briefcase, and wearing the satisfied expression of someone bearing news that had been worth waiting for. At 73, the older man had found new energy in the work of distributing Elena's legacy, as if decades of preparation were finally paying dividends in the currency that mattered most. Lives restored and communities healed. "The last of the pension distributions are complete," Kingston announced, setting his briefcase on the conference table with the ceremony of someone delivering a sacred trust. "Every worker who lost money in the Westfield scheme has been compensated in full, plus interest calculated from the date of the theft." Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The pension distributions had been his highest priority, the foundation upon which everything else was built. For 6 months, teams of forensic accountants and legal advocates had worked to identify every victim of Westfield's conspiracy, to calculate exact losses, and to ensure that justice was measured not just in prison sentences, but in restored security for families who had lost everything to criminal greed. It had been painstakingly slow work, complicated by the fact that many of the victims had scattered across the country after losing their jobs, searching for work in cities where manufacturing still existed and economic opportunities hadn't been deliberately destroyed by financial predators. But Elena's methods had included provisions for exactly this kind of distribution, systems designed to find victims wherever they had gone, and return what belonged to them, regardless of how far they had traveled in their search for survival. "What about the criminal cases?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer from news reports that had been following the prosecutions with the intensity usually reserved for celebrity trials. "Westfield and 11 of his co-conspirators pled guilty yesterday," Kingston said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had waited decades to see justice served at the appropriate temperature. "They're facing sentences ranging from 25 to 40 years each, with no possibility of parole before serving at least 15 years. The judge made it clear that financial crimes against working families would be punished with the full severity of the law." Daniel looked up from his homework with the interest that children brought to adult conversations they were trying to understand. "Are the bad guys going to stay in jail forever?" "Not forever," Kingston explained, with the patience of someone who understood that children needed honest answers to serious questions, "but for long enough that they won't be hurting anyone else. And more importantly, the money they stole has been returned to the people they took it from." Marcus walked to the window and looked down at the construction crews working to restore the building's exterior. The Elena Vasquez Justice Center was becoming exactly what Elena had envisioned. A place where powerful people could be held accountable for their crimes, where ordinary people could find the resources to fight back against injustice, and where communities could heal from wounds that had been deliberately inflicted by those who viewed other people's prosperity as their own opportunity. "There's something else," Kingston said, opening his briefcase and withdrawing a legal document thick enough to represent months of careful planning and international coordination. "Elena's foundation is being approached by communities across the country, places where similar crimes have been committed, but the perpetrators haven't been caught yet." Marcus read through the document, which outlined requests for assistance from towns in Ohio, Michigan, West Virginia, and North Carolina. Each had suffered the same pattern of corporate looting and pension theft that had devastated Millbrook, but they lacked the evidence needed to pursue justice through traditional legal channels. They had heard about what happened in Pennsylvania, about how one man's courage to open a vault had led to the recovery of stolen millions and the imprisonment of criminals who had thought themselves untouchable. "They want us to help them," Marcus said, understanding now that Elena's work had been bigger than one town, more important than one conspiracy, more necessary than he had initially imagined. "They want us to investigate, to gather evidence, to build cases that prosecutors can pursue," Kingston clarified. Elena's techniques were sometimes unconventional, but they were also devastatingly effective. "The question is whether we're prepared to expand her mission beyond Millbrook." Marcus thought about the families in those other communities, people who had worked their entire lives only to have their futures stolen by criminals who operated with the casual efficiency of people harvesting crops they had planted specifically for that purpose. He thought about Elena's legacy and what she would want him to do with the resources and knowledge she had left him. He thought about Daniel, who was listening to this conversation with the intense concentration of a child, trying to understand how the adult world worked and what his place might be in making it better. What would it involve? Marcus asked, though part of him already knew the answer, and another part was already committed to whatever the work required. Establishing a network of investigators and legal advocates, people who understand how financial crimes are committed and how to expose them when traditional law enforcement lacks the resources or political independence to act, Kingston explained. It would mean traveling, taking risks, making enemies among very powerful people who have unlimited resources for revenge. Marcus looked at Daniel, who had stopped pretending to do homework and was openly listening to a conversation that would determine the course of both their lives. His son had already paid a price for his father's choice to fight injustice, had faced danger that no 7-year-old should have to encounter, had learned lessons about courage and consequence that most children absorbed gradually, over years, rather than suddenly over days. Was it fair to ask him to pay more? Was it right to choose a mission that would put them both at risk, when they could instead choose safety and comfort, and the kind of anonymous prosperity that $240 million could provide if they decided to keep some of it for themselves? "Daddy," Daniel said quietly, interrupting Marcus's internal debate, with the timing that children seemed to possess for moments when adults needed guidance from wisdom that hadn't yet been complicated by experience. "Remember what you told me about Superman?" Marcus smiled, remembering a conversation that seemed like it had happened years ago rather than months ago, back when his biggest worry had been whether they could afford rent, and his greatest ambition had been finding steady work that would keep them fed and housed. "What about Superman?" Marcus asked. "You said he could have stayed on his home planet where it was safe. But then Earth wouldn't have anyone to protect it from bad guys," Daniel said, with the serious tone he used when explaining important concepts to adults who seemed to need reminding of obvious truths. "You said heroes don't get to choose between being safe and being helpful. They have to choose to help people, even when it's scary." Out of the mouths of babes, Marcus thought, remembering his own father's favorite expression for moments when children revealed truths that adults had managed to forget or complicate beyond recognition. Marcus knelt beside his son's chair and looked into the brown eyes that reminded him so much of Sarah, seeing in them not just inherited features, but inherited values, the moral clarity that his wife had tried to teach their son before cancer took her voice away. "What do you think we should do, buddy?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew what his son's answer would be. Daniel considered the question with the gravity it deserved, understanding somehow that this wasn't just about them but about all the families in all the towns where powerful people were stealing from those who couldn't fight back effectively. "I think we should help the other people," Daniel said finally. "But I think we should be really careful so the bad guys can't hurt us while we're helping." Marcus looked at Kingston, who was watching this exchange with something that might have been pride, or might have been concern, or might have been the recognition that wisdom sometimes came from unexpected sources. "We would need safeguards," Marcus said, thinking like a construction worker who understood that dangerous work required proper safety equipment and careful planning. Security measures, legal protections, ways to ensure that Daniel stays safe, no matter what kind of enemies we make. "All of that can be arranged," Kingston assured him. Elena had resources that extended far beyond this building, connections with law enforcement agencies that operate above corruption, relationships with journalists who can't be bought or intimidated, arrangements with security firms that specialize in protecting people who make powerful enemies. Marcus stood and walked back to the window, looking out at the town of Millbrook that was slowly coming back to life like a patient recovering from surgery. New businesses were opening in storefronts that had been empty for years. Young families were moving back to take advantage of affordable housing and schools that were improving now that the community had resources to invest in education. The Justice Center would provide job training and small business loans, ensuring that the economic recovery was sustainable and broad-based, rather than dependent on the charity of others. All of this had been possible because one woman had refused to accept that powerful people could steal with impunity, and because one man had found the courage to continue her work when it would have been easier and safer to walk away. "All right," Marcus said, feeling the words leave his mouth before he had consciously decided to speak them. "Let's do it, but we do it right. We build systems that will outlast us, that will keep working even if something happens to the people who started them." Kingston smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had spent his life waiting for the right moment to deploy weapons he had been keeping in reserve for decades. "Elena would be proud," Kingston said simply. Over the following weeks, the Elena Vasquez Justice Foundation took shape with a speed that surprised everyone involved. Elena's financial resources, combined with donations from grateful Millbrook residents and matching funds from federal crime victim compensation programs, created an endowment large enough to sustain operations indefinitely. More importantly, the foundation's work had attracted the attention of people who understood that justice sometimes required operating outside traditional channels. Retired federal investigators offered their services, drawn by the opportunity to pursue cases that their former agencies couldn't touch due to political pressure or resource constraints. Forensic accountants, who had spent their careers building cases against white-collar criminals, volunteered their expertise, motivated by the chance to work on cases where success would be measured in restored lives, rather than bureaucratic performance metrics. Journalists who specialized in financial corruption began coordinating with the foundation, sharing information and resources in ways that maximized the impact of investigations while protecting sources and evidence from retaliation. Even some active duty law enforcement officers, frustrated by their department's inability to pursue powerful criminals effectively, found ways to provide unofficial assistance. When cases developed evidence that could be prosecuted through official channels, Marcus found himself becoming something he had never expected to be: an administrator, a coordinator, a leader of people whose expertise far exceeded his own, but who looked to him for vision and direction. It was a role that required skills he had learned on construction sites rather than in boardrooms, the ability to see how different parts fit together, to coordinate complex operations under pressure, to make decisions quickly when safety and success depended on decisive action. But he also made sure that the foundation's work remained grounded in the real world, in the experiences of ordinary people who had been victimized by extraordinary crimes. Every case began with human stories: workers who had lost their pensions, families who had been cheated out of their homes, communities that had been systematically looted by people who viewed them as nothing more than sources of profit. Daniel thrived in their new life, though it was unlike anything Marcus could have imagined when they had first arrived in Millbrook 6 months earlier. The boy loved the bustle of the Justice Center, enjoyed meeting the investigators and prosecutors who worked there, and took pride in his father's role as what he called the boss of catching bad guys. But Daniel had also become something of an unofficial advisor, offering insights that came from his uncomplicated understanding of right and wrong. When Marcus struggled with complicated ethical questions about investigative techniques or prosecutorial strategies, Daniel would often cut through the complexity with observations that were both simple and profound. Bad guys count on good guys being too scared or too tired to stop them, Daniel said one evening as they worked together on plans for a new foundation office in Ohio. But if the good guys work together and don't give up, then the bad guys can't win, can they? Marcus looked at his son, amazed once again by the wisdom that children possessed when adults hadn't yet taught them to doubt their moral instincts. Elena Vasquez had understood the same truth. Injustice persisted because good people accepted it as inevitable, but it could be defeated when ordinary citizens decided to fight back with the same determination that criminals brought to their predation. 1 year after the confrontation with Westfield in the vault beneath the Justice Center, Marcus received a letter that changed his understanding of how far Elena's legacy had already spread. It came from a woman named Maria Santos, who lived in a small town in Texas, where a similar pension theft scheme had bankrupted the local chemical plant and destroyed thousands of retirements. But this wasn't a request for help. It was a thank you note that revealed how justice could spread like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Dear Mr. Rivera, the letter read in careful handwriting that reminded Marcus of the notes his mother used to send to his teachers. You don't know me, but I know what you did in Millbrook. My husband was one of the workers who lost his pension when our plant was sold to investors who looted the retirement fund and then declared bankruptcy. We thought we would never see justice, that powerful people like that were above the law, and ordinary people like us just had to accept whatever happened to us. But last week, the FBI arrested the executives who stole our money, using evidence that was gathered by investigators who learned their techniques from your foundation. Our stolen pensions are being returned with interest, and the criminals are going to prison for a long time. But more than that, we've learned that we don't have to accept injustice just because the people committing crimes have more money than we do. Thank you for showing us that ordinary people can fight back when they work together. Thank you for proving that doing the right thing still matters in this world. Marcus showed the letter to Daniel, who read it carefully with the attention he brought to all documents that seemed important to adults. When he finished, the boy looked up with a smile that reminded Marcus of Sarah's expression when she was particularly pleased about something. Daddy, does this mean we're heroes now? Daniel asked. Marcus thought about the question seriously, considering what it meant to be a hero in a world where courage was often measured in small acts rather than dramatic gestures. Were they heroes? They had certainly helped people, had fought against injustice, had risked their safety to protect others. But heroism, Marcus was beginning to understand, wasn't about individual acts of courage. It was about choosing, every day, to stand with the vulnerable against the powerful, to work for justice even when it was difficult or dangerous or thankless. I think, Marcus said carefully, that we're people who decided to help, and when enough people make that choice, heroic things start to happen. Outside the conference room windows, the sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Marcus of the first evening he had spent in this building, when it had seemed like nothing more than a problem to be solved rather than a mission to be embraced. The town below was alive with purpose again. Lights in the windows of reopened businesses, children playing in parks that had been restored with recovered pension funds, families building futures that criminals had tried to steal, but justice had restored. Marcus thought about Sarah's last words, about the things she hadn't been able to tell him before the cancer took her voice away. He understood now that she had been trying to prepare him for this moment, for the choice between safety and service that would define the rest of his life and shape the kind of man Daniel would remember his father to be. Elena Vasquez had left them more than money and evidence and a building that contained both. She had left them the opportunity to become the kind of people who made the world better by refusing to accept that evil could triumph over good. that power could escape justice, that ordinary people couldn't accomplish extraordinary things when they decided that helping others was more important than protecting themselves. The basement vault still held some of Elena's original files, cases that remained unsolved, criminals who hadn't yet faced justice for their crimes. But now it also held something new. Letters from communities that had been helped by the Foundation's work. Photographs of families whose lives had been restored. Evidence that Elena's vision was spreading beyond Millbrook to every corner of the country where powerful people preyed on the vulnerable. Daniel returned to his homework, humming one of the songs his mother used to sing when she thought no one was listening. Marcus returned to his plans for expanding the Foundation's work, knowing that somewhere in America, other families were facing the same choice he had faced in this building. The choice between walking away from trouble and standing up for what was right. The work would continue because it had to continue. There would always be criminals who thought their wealth made them untouchable. Always be communities that needed someone to fight for them when their own resources weren't sufficient to challenge powerful predators. Always be families who deserved justice even when the legal system had been corrupted or intimidated into silence. But there would also be people like Elena Vasquez, who used their advantages to protect those who had none. There would be people like Kingston, who dedicated their lives to missions larger than personal profit. There would be people like Marcus, who chose courage over comfort when the choice mattered most. And there would be children like Daniel, who grew up understanding that heroes weren't people with special powers. They were ordinary people who decided that helping others was what gave life meaning, that justice was worth fighting for even when the cost was high, that good people working together could accomplish anything when they refused to give up. As the lights came on across Millbrook, and the business of ordinary life resumed in the town below, Marcus Rivera sat in his office and planned the next day's work. There were criminals to investigate, evidence to gather, justice to pursue. There were phone calls to return from prosecutors, building cases against financial predators, meetings to schedule with communities that needed help, reports to review from investigators who were tracking stolen money across international boundaries. But there was also Daniel's parent-teacher conference to attend, soccer practice to coach, bedtime stories to read about heroes who chose to help instead of choosing to hide. Because heroes, Marcus had learned, didn't stop being fathers when they started fighting for justice. They just taught their children that some things were worth the risk, that ordinary people could change the world when they decided that other people's problems were their problems too. The woman who had bought an old mansion for 75 cents and discovered millions in the basement. The mechanic who had stopped to help a crying biker and discovered that kindness could transform communities. The father who had inherited a building full of secrets and chose to use them for justice rather than profit. They were all connected by the same truth, that courage didn't require superpowers, just the willingness to help when help was needed. That justice was possible even when it seemed impossible, if enough people decided it was worth pursuing. That ordinary heroes could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose service over safety, community over comfort, truth over convenience. Marcus Rivera had been left with nothing but grief, and a 7-year-old son who needed a father strong enough to build a future from the pieces of their broken past. He had discovered that he possessed something more valuable than money, more powerful than connections, more lasting than any inheritance measured in dollars. The courage to stand up for what was right, even when doing so put everything he valued at risk. Elena Vasquez had built a legacy that would outlive them all. A fortress of justice that protected the vulnerable from those who would prey upon them. A reminder that the powerful only won when good people chose to do nothing. And in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, in a restored office tower that had once held secrets worth killing for, a widowed father and his son continued the work of proving that truth was stronger than money, that justice was more powerful than corruption, and that ordinary people could save the world one community at a time. The work would continue. The bad guys would be caught, and somewhere in America, another family facing impossible odds would discover that they weren't alone, that people they'd never met were willing to fight for them, and that justice was possible even when the whole world seemed to have given up on making things right. Because that's what heroes do. They help, they persist. They prove that good can triumph over evil when ordinary people find extraordinary courage. And they teach their children that the most important question isn't whether you can make a difference, but whether you will choose to try. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that ordinary people can change the world when they decide to stand together for justice.